Questions to think about. This chapter describes 5 components to a problem. Can you identify these in some everyday problems? See if you can describe a common problem using the terminology we discussed. Okay, so the parts of a problem are the initial state, givens feed into this, and the initial state goes to obstacles, and then means feed in with this to counter obstacles, and then from the obstacles to the goal state. A common problem using these terms. First, you can define a problem as a gap or barrier between the initial or current state of affairs and the eventual goal. It's like an exigence. And the gap or barrier alone has to be one in which there is no immediate route to a solution. Okay, let's say how to find a partner labeled in these 5. So the initial state is single. The givens are things like your personality, things like your physical appearance, things like your lifestyle, your profession, your race, your gender. The obstacles would be things like mental health issues, things like neurodivergence, things like maybe being unattractive or being too attractive, or where you live, your socioeconomic status, your family. And means would be the ways that you solve these obstacles. So things like getting therapy to help your mental health, things like maybe, learning from a pickup artist, learning from your friends how to flirt, learning how to get along with the opposite sex. And the goal state would be being in a relationship. How often do you find yourself using some of the general problem-solving heuristics that were described in this chapter? Do you ever rely on hill climbing or means end analysis? Like studying for my math test, I try to study in a way that brings me closer to the result that I want. Honestly, I use means end analysis way more than hill climbing because a lot of times the issue is time, right? Like getting closer to the solution given a time constraint. So anytime you're like doing something to get closer to the solution, but it involves time and you don't directly move closer to the solution, is kind of moving further away, which is means end analysis. Like I was stressed out this week about getting marks, so I went to a therapist. Now that took that time and I moved away from the goal by not studying during that time. But the point is hopefully it will help efficiency later, or like organizing notes. So it's what I've heard described as the difference between movement and motion. Motion is getting you closer to the goal state, but movement is like little things that are necessary to get yourself in motion. If you just do all motion, you just won't be able to get yourself to get anywhere. And if it's all movement and no forward momentum, you're like rocking back and forth, that's not going to work either. You need like a mix of that. Maybe obviously as much, motion as possible relevant to compared to movement, but that doesn't really work like that. Sometimes you need a lot of movement to get the motion going. Research has shown that people can rely on prior examples to help them solve problems. What is the role of similarity in this case? Would this kind of example-based problem solving be most associated with System 1 thinking or System 2 thinking? So the role of similarity, it's like you want an analogy, so you need things to the more things line up as the same as what you've already encountered, the more likely your problem generated using analogy will be successful. I think we learned about that in the chapter about inference. Example-based problem solving is most associated with System 1 because it's based on memory. So productive thinking is thinking that generates new ideas, new behaviors, or new conclusions about the world. An example of productive thinking is solving problems by insight. Whereas reproductive thinking is thinking that emphasizes the recall of information from memory. So when you're looking at example-based problem solving using analogy, this is reproductive thinking. It emphasizes the recall of information from memory, such as solving a similar math problem. And System 1 thinking in dual process theory is the faster, more intuitive, and evolutionarily more primitive system I know it looks at memory and emotions to come up with solutions. System 2, in dual process theory, this is the slower, more deliberative, and evolutionarily more recent system. So again, I imagine, since System 1 is about memory and I think thus examples, and System 2 is about insight and deep thinking, I think you use System 1 when you can because it's faster. So if you have memories to help you, you just use the System 1 thinking. You wouldn't go to System 2 unless you need to really work it out, which is why experts are so effective, because they don't need to really dig in there to already know the answer. So they're much more efficient, quicker at finding out what to do. Okay, maybe this is not the case. It is technically System 2 thinking because it talks about an expert as someone who can rely on a heuristic approach via System 2 to retrieve a possible solution from memory. I know System 1 is defined as using heuristics or mental shortcuts, so I'm really interested in how he will explain this in the last chapter. So I guess, technically, according to this textbook on thinking, System 2 thinking uses heuristics to solve problems from memory based on similarity and analogy to problems in the past. Maybe it's both System 1 and System 2 thinking, but it looks like he's defining it as System 2 thinking using heuristics when you're using memory and analogy to solve problems.